I have always loved this view. Me too.
The night before Zephyrria's ascension, the moon tower stood against the sky like a silver blade cutting through dark cloth. She had climbed those stairs 100 times, but tonight felt different. Tonight, every stone beneath her feet seemed to whisper her name back at her. She stood at the viewing platform, her gown catching the moonlight, silver thread and sheer panels that made her look like she had been woven from the night itself. The moonshadow dominion stretched below her, thousands of glowing windows dotting the valley like fireflies that had forgotten to fly. She pressed both palms flat against the stone railing and breathed in the cold air, the smell of pine forests and deep earth filling her lungs until she felt full of something she did not have a name for yet. Tomorrow. Tomorrow she would take the wolf oath. Tomorrow the crown would rest on her head and the full weight of an entire people would rest on her shoulders. She had dreamed of this moment and feared it equally because she understood what it meant. Not just power, responsibility, lives, footsteps. She did not turn right away. She recognized the sound of them, slightly heavier on the left side, the result of an old fall from a tree they had climbed together as children. Erisa, her elder sister, appeared beside her, dressed in deep purple with gold embroidery that caught the moonlight sharply. A crown glinted at her temples, and she folded her hands over the railing the way she always did, when she was about to say something she had rehearsed. "I have always loved this view," Erisa said softly. Zephyria smiled. "Me too." Silence settled between them, the comfortable kind. The way silence only is between people who have shared the same childhood, the same long table, the same father's voice. Then Erisa's hand rose to Zephyria's back, warm and steady, like a sister offering quiet comfort on the edge of a great beginning. And then she pushed, not a stumble, not an accident, a deliberate two-handed shove that put all of Erisa's cold, rehearsed certainty into it. Zephyria's gasp swallowed itself as the railing disappeared and the world tilted past reason. Stone rushed past her in long gray streaks. Wind raked her dark hair across her face and into her mouth. Her wolf screamed inside her chest, raw and desperate, clawing for a shift that shock had made impossible. The tower's face blurred beside her. 60 feet, 80, the dark valley growing wider, rushing upward. Erisa. The name burned through her mind the way understanding burns, hotter than anger, deeper than grief. Her sister, her beloved, difficult, quietly wounded elder sister, who had just stood beside her in the moonlight with warmth in her hands, had pushed her. Somewhere deep inside her chest, a thread snapped. Not a physical thing, something older. Something tied to a soul she had never met in waking life, but had carried in her bones since the night she first shifted. A thread of gold running from her sternum outward to a point east of the capital, east of everything, taut and warm and always present. The mate bond. It cracked like glass under a boot heel. Far across the Dominion, in the Eastern War Hall where he had been studying borderland maps by candlelight, Torvian Blackmere staggered sideways and grabbed the edge of the heavy oak table. His second in command, Corvin Lismere, caught him by the arm with both hands. "My lord!" Torvian could not answer. He pressed a fist to his chest and felt a pain that had no wound, no source, no explanation his mind could reach for. His wolf went still inside him, so completely, suddenly still, that for 3 terrifying seconds, he thought it had died. Then it howled, long, broken, grief-soaked, The sound of an animal that has lost something it cannot name, and Torvian Blackmere, Alpha King of the Moonshadow Dominion, did not know why his soul was screaming. Only that somewhere out there, in the dark between him and the capital, something had gone terribly wrong. Back at the tower, the valley floor came up to meet Zephyria with brutal finality, and darkness swallowed everything. Hey, quick question. How are you feeling right now? Because I am feeling that one too. Thank you so much for being here. It genuinely means the world to me. This kind of story only grows when people like you show up and stay. So, if this opening already has your heart in its grip, please hit that subscribe button for us, smash the like, and drop a comment telling us where you are watching from. It helps more than you know, and I personally read every single one. All right, thank you. Now, let's get back to Zephyria. 3 days before the fall, the palace kitchen smelled like warm bread, and Lyriel Voswin was arguing with a pastry chef about the correct way to fold honey cream into a celebration tart. Zephyria sat at the small corner table where she always ate her private breakfasts. Not in the grand dining hall where the council watched her posture and catalogued her choices, and listened to Lyriel's voice carry through the archway with the same fondness one feels for a storm that is reliably predictable. Lyriel was her handmaid, her confidant, and the most opinionated woman in the entire Dominion. She was also almost always right, which made her impossible to argue with and absolutely necessary. "You look tired," Lyriel said, when she finally swept back through the door, brushing flour from her sleeve with brisk efficiency. And not the dignified kind of tired, the kind where you have been lying awake, thinking too loudly. Zephyria wrapped both hands around her cup. "I have been reading the border reports. At midnight, people live on those borders." Lyriel sat across from her without being asked. So because she had decided years ago that formality between them was a waste of both their time, and she had been correct. "The Ascension is in 3 days," she said. "The border reports will still exist on the 4th day. You, however, need rest so you do not pass out during the wolf oath, which would be, and I say this with love, an absolutely catastrophic way to begin a reign." Zephyria laughed. A real one, not the measured kind she used in the council hall. She had spent the better part of her life becoming the heir her father believed she could be. Not because it was required of her, but because she had sat beside him as a small child and watched him make decisions. And she had understood very early that every choice a leader makes lands somewhere real, on someone, in someone's home, field, or family. That understanding had never left her. It was, her father had once told her quietly, the reason he had chosen her over Erissa. She had never repeated that to Erissa. She had tried more than once to bridge the distance that lived between them, like a third presence in every room they shared. Erissa was brilliant, composed, beautifully articulate in council settings. She was also, underneath all of that, deeply wounded by a decision made when they were still young enough to be changed by it. Zephyria understood that wound. She had tried to give it room. She just had not understood how wide it had grown. The mate bond had found Zephyria 2 years before the Ascension, on a winter evening when a delegation from the Eastern Territories arrived for a borderland summit. She had not been looking for it. Then it hit her. A sudden, complete awareness of another person in the room, as though her wolf had simply turned and pointed and said, "Him. Torvian Blackmere." He was taller than she had imagined for a man who moved with that quality of controlled stillness. Dark eyes that held every room they entered without effort. a jaw that seemed shaped from the same material as the mountains east of the Dominion. He wore his authority the way old trees wear bark. Not as decoration, not as armor, but simply as what he was. He had looked across the summit room and found her immediately, now as though her wolf certainty had traveled through the air and landed in him at exactly the same moment. Neither of them had been prepared. Their formal courtship, 7 months of politically observed, council-approved careful progression, had lasted until Zephyria finally lost patience with decorum and kissed him first, in the middle of a diplomatic reception where she was meant to be discussing water route agreements. Torvian had been so startled that he had laughed. A genuine, some unguarded laugh she had never heard from him in public company. And then he had kissed her back in a way that made the entire preceding 7 months feel like the most unnecessary delay of her life. The bond was not formally sealed yet. The ceremony required her ascension first, but the bond lived between them regardless, warm, steady, a low hum she was always aware of. She was aware of it now, sitting at her breakfast table, and it made tomorrow feel both closer and more possible. Neirissa came to Zephyria's chambers first. She knocked, which she almost never did, and when Zephyria opened the door, she found her sister dressed in full court clothes at an hour when most people had already changed into something comfortable. Eirissa's expression wore a practiced neutrality that Zephyria had learned, over a lifetime of sisterhood, to read poorly. "Walk with me," Eirissa said, "like we used to." And Zephyria, because she always chose hope over suspicion when it came to her sister, said yes. They walked the long south corridor, past the ancestor portraits in their carved frames, past the council room with its heavy wooden doors. Eirissa talked about light things, a council member's recent poor behavior, a rumor about northern supply delays, the kind of conversation that fills space without requiring anything from either person. At the top of the spiral stairs, the night was wide open and cold. Zephyria stepped onto the platform and felt the wind pull at her gown, and for a moment she was simply present. Not a future queen, not her father's legacy walking in human form, just a woman in the night air, looking at everything she loved, feeling the quiet joy of a life about to begin its next chapter. She heard Eirissa step close behind her. She felt the warmth of her hands, familiar, sisterly, trusted. And then the world ended. The fall lasted 4 seconds and felt like 4 years. Her wolf fought desperately against the shock that had frozen her limbs, howling with everything it had. Stone blurred beside her in gray streaks. Below, the valley floor was dark and far, and then suddenly, not far at all. The impact was not like anything she had imagined pain could be. It was more like light, a sudden, white, total erasure of everything. Her wolf's howl cut off at the exact moment of contact, leaving a silence inside her more frightening than the fall itself. Then there was nothing at all. Torvian Blackmere did not sleep that night. He sent Corvin Lismere to the palace on a protocol verification errand that no one believed, but no one questioned. Corvin returned 2 hours before dawn with news that made Torvian go very still in the center of his war hall. Zephyria's chambers were empty. Her handmaid, Lyriel Voswin, was conducting a frantic private search. And the palace guard had been organized into what Eirissa was officially calling a recovery search. Not a rescue search, recovery, as though the outcome had already been determined. He stood with that word in the silence of his war hall and felt the bond in his chest. Not cleanly severed, not the absolute silence of a death-severed connection, but muted, dampened, as though someone had thrown heavy cloth over a signal that was still trying to transmit. His wolf would not stop pacing. She was alive. He believed she was alive with a certainty that had no rational basis and no evidence, which was part of what made the next weeks the most difficult of his life. Because certainty and evidence are not the same thing, and without evidence, he could not act. Not yet. Not without understanding exactly what had happened and who had made it happen. But he would understand. He began that night. Dravor found her at the base of the valley cliff 3 hours after dawn. He had been moving east with a small group, himself, Arinth Valian, and 2 rogue settlement runners, on a route he used precisely because no one else did. The valley below the moon tower was overgrown and difficult, and sat outside the capital's regular patrol radius, which made it exactly the kind of terrain Dravor preferred. 6 years of exile had turned him into a man who moved through the spaces between official attention. He almost did not see her. She was half buried under a fall of loose shale and broken brush, her silver gown so caked with dust and dried blood that it barely registered as fabric. Arinth saw her first and stopped walking. Dravor crouched beside her and pressed 2 fingers to her throat. A pulse, thready and uncertain, but present. Her wolf was still in there too, barely, like a coal someone had stepped on, but not completely extinguished. He looked up at the cliff face above them, calculated the height with a single practiced assessment. Looked back at the woman breathing in short, broken intervals in the dirt at his feet. She fell from the moon tower, he said. He was not asking. Arinth stared up at the sheer stone face. Nothing survives that fall. She did, Dravor said. He stood. We move her. He was not a man who spent time debating his own decisions. He had learned, through 6 years of living on the wrong side of every political line in the Dominion, that the time spent second-guessing was time that could be better used solving the immediate problem. The immediate problem was a woman dying in a ditch who should not be alive but was. He picked her up himself, and they moved. Alwyn Mirith met them at the edge of the Ashwood settlement with her medicine bag already open, because Arinth had sent a runner ahead, and because Elwyn had long since learned to simply be ready for whatever Dravor's people brought back from outside. She did not recognize Zephyria at first. The gown gave her pause, the style unmistakably Dominion court, but the face was swollen, and the dark hair was so matted with dust and blood that the features were obscured. She recognized her an hour into treatment, when the swelling had reduced enough to see clearly. She sat back on her heels, looked at the face of the woman she had just spent an hour pulling back from the edge of death. Then she looked at Dravor, who was leaning against the far wall of the healing tent with his arms folded, watching with his usual economy of expression. "Do you know who this is?" she asked. "I know she fell from the moon tower," he said. "She is Zephyria," Elwyn said, "the Luna Heir of the Moonshadow Dominion. She was supposed to be crowned in 2 days." Silence. Dravor uncrossed his arms and walked to the cot. He looked down at the face of someone who had survived something that had no business being survivable. And something in his expression shifted. Not softened exactly, but recalibrated. "Then we have a complication," he said. "We have a responsibility," Elwyn replied, in the particular even tone she used when a decision had already been made, and she was simply informing the room. Dravor looked at her. Elwyn looked back. He turned and walked out without answering, which, as anyone who had known him long enough understood, meant she had won the argument. Zephyria woke on the 4th day. thanks not to comfort or clarity, to confusion and a silence inside her chest that was louder than anything she had ever experienced. Her wolf was still present. She could feel it, but reaching for it was like reaching for something in a dark room and only touching the edge of it. There, but not close. Retreated somewhere deep in response to something too large to process. Elowen explained it in The Patient, in careful voice of a healer who understood that delivering too much information too quickly was its own form of cruelty. The fall had not killed her. A combination of her wolf's instinctive, last-second partial shift and a landing that had been cushioned, barely, by the overgrown brush had preserved her life against all reasonable expectation. But the shock had done something to the wolf. Wolves are linked to the soul as much as the body. The double impact, physical and emotional, and fall and betrayal delivered simultaneously, had driven it inward. "It will come back," Elowen said. "Not quickly, but it will." Zephyria lay on the cot and stared at the canvas above her. She thought about Erissa's hands, the warmth of them, the deliberateness of the push, the fact that her sister had looked her in the eyes minutes before and had not hesitated. She had spent so many years trying to account for Erissa's pain, trying to be careful around it, not to trigger it, not to make it worse simply by existing in the way she had been asked to exist. She had quietly folded parts of herself in half to give Erissa more room. And Erissa had walked her to the edge of everything and pushed. The grief of it was not clean, not the simple, manageable kind of hurt that comes from ordinary disappointment. It was layered and complicated, and underneath all of it sat a question she did not want to look at directly. Had there been a moment, somewhere in all those years, when she could have changed this? She sat with that question for a long time. It did not produce an answer, but sitting with it honestly, without looking away from it, was, she would understand this later, the beginning of something important. The mate bond was the strangest part of the silence. She could feel it, faintly, like music heard through 3 closed doors. Not gone, not severed the way it would be in death. Just muted and distant. If she could barely sense him, then the reverse was also true. He would not know with certainty whether she had survived. He would be living in the space between knowing and not knowing. And for Torvian Blackmere, a man not built for uncertainty, that would be its own particular suffering. She hated that she was the cause of his pain. However, unintentionally, she could not fix it yet. But she filed it away, the knowledge of what he was carrying, in the same place she filed everything that required her to become stronger before she could address it. Dravor ran his settlement with the efficiency of someone who had built everything from nothing and had no patience for anything that did not serve a clear purpose. He gave Zephyria 2 weeks to recover. Then he walked into her healing tent one morning, looked at her sitting up and eating solid food, and announced that her legs were working and recovery was not the same thing as hiding. He set a pair of worn practice bracers on the edge of her cot and waited. "I don't know what you think is about to happen," she said. "You will learn to defend yourself without your wolf," he said, "because your wolf is not fully reliable right now. The world does not wait for reliability." She stared at him. He stared back with the particular stillness of a man who had survived 6 years in exile by making himself very difficult to read. "You grew up in a palace," he continued. "That is not criticism. It is observation. Everything you know about power came with walls around it and other people to enforce it. Out here, power is entirely personal. It starts with you. If you intend to go back and do whatever you are planning to do, you need to become something the palace never made you. She put on the bracers. The first month was genuinely, reliably humbling. She had never been trained as a fighter. Luna Heirs received political education, diplomatic training, pack law, ceremonial protocol. And she could negotiate a borderland treaty in her sleep and recite palace procedure backward. She could not, it turned out, effectively fight a man half a head taller than her without spending most of her time reintroducing herself to the ground. Arinth Valian was her first sparring partner. He was skilled enough to be a genuine challenge and considerate enough to take only the falls that would teach her something useful. He had an easy, unhurried manner that made consistent defeat slightly more tolerable, and a dry sense of humor that surfaced at moments when it was most needed. You telegraph your left side every time before you commit, he told her one morning, after she had ended up in the dirt for the 4th time in a row. I'm aware. You've been aware for 3 sessions now. I said, I'm aware. He pulled her up. Being aware and stopping are technically 2 different things. She stopped telegraphing her left within the week. What the palace had never taught her, and what the wasteland was teaching her now, with considerable efficiency, was the difference between knowing what people needed and being able to do something about it directly, without a council to process the decision, without a treasury to draw from, without the machinery of governance to translate intention into action. Out here, so if someone in the settlement was hungry, the question was immediate. What was available? Who could get it? How quickly? And what would it cost in other resources? There was no distance between the decision and the consequence. No buffer. No intermediary layer to absorb the gap between good intention and practical result. It changed something in her. Not who she was. She was still the person who could not hear about suffering without needing to address it. But how she operated. She became faster, more direct, more willing to make an imperfect decision immediately than wait for a perfect one later, because waiting had a cost too. And out here, that cost had a face. Dravor watched this with the interested detachment of a man who had expected it, but was perhaps slightly surprised by how cleanly it happened. He did not compliment her on it. He simply started including her in decisions. That, she understood, was the compliment. By the 3rd month, her wolf had begun to return. Not all at once. In pieces, the way trust comes back after it has been broken. Carefully, testing the ground before committing weight. Some mornings she would wake and feel it close, warm against her rib cage, and she would lie very still and let it settle rather than reaching toward it and frightening it back into retreat. Alawan said this was exactly right. You cannot force a healing, she said. You can only make the conditions where healing becomes possible. Zephyria thought about that principle often, not only about her wolf. She thought about the rogue settlement too, about the people living on Dravor's stretch of the wasteland, far from the capital and its protections. These were wolves who had been exiled, displaced, or simply forgotten by a system that had stopped accounting for them. Some were there because of genuine wrongdoing. More were there because of politics, because of who they had been loyal to, or who they had refused to become loyal to. They had built something real in the absence of anything official. It was rough and without ceremony, but it worked. People were fed. Disputes were settled. Children were taught. The elderly were cared for. She started contributing more directly, not as a future queen visiting common life to learn a lesson, but as someone who had skills that were genuinely useful to the people around her. Her knowledge of pack law helped settle a land dispute between two families that had been quietly festering for 2 years. Her negotiating experience was put to immediate use when a supply trader tried to inflate prices during a dry season and found himself across a table from a woman who had studied negotiation since she was 12. The trader left with fair prices and a slightly unsettled expression. Word moved through the rogue settlement network. The Luna Heir was alive. She was among them. And she was not what the capital stories had made her. One evening, she found Dravor sitting at the settlement's eastern edge, looking out toward the capital. She sat beside him without ceremony. He accepted this the way he accepted most things. In silence, without objection. "You have made yourself useful," he said eventually. "That is the most enthusiastic endorsement I've ever received." He glanced at her sideways with the expression that served as his version of genuine amusement. "It is the truest one." She looked east, somewhere in that direction, across mountain ranges and river valleys, and carefully managed political geography. A throne was being warmed by someone who had purchased it with her life. A council was being managed by someone too intelligent to believe the official account, and too careful, so far, to say so openly. And somewhere closer than all of that, a man was building a case against a wall of deliberate deception, one careful question at a time. "I need to go back," she said. "I know. I can't do it alone." "I know that too." He was quiet for a moment. "I am not going back to the capital to restore a monarchy. I'm not asking you to." She turned to face him directly. "I'm asking you to help put back something that actually protects the people living out here. Not a crown, a system, one that remembers the edges exist." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "I will speak to the settlement leaders." It was not a yes, but it was the step before yes. And she had learned by now that with Dravor, the two were essentially the same thing. Back in the capital, Arissa had moved with impressive, cold efficiency. She announced Zephyrria's death the morning after the fall. "A tragic accident during a late-night walk," she said, her voice precisely calibrated to something that looked enough like grief to pass the first inspection. The palace went into official mourning. The council gathered, and then, with a speed that anyone paying close attention should have found suspicious, but which Arissa delivered with enough composed conviction to read as necessary, she petitioned the council to name her interim regent. The Dominion could not go without leadership, she argued, not with border pressures and supply negotiations and a succession that had not yet been formally completed. Mareth Silvaris, who had served the Dominion's council for 30 years and had developed over 3 decades of watching powerful people perform their performances, a very finely tuned sensitivity to the difference between genuine grief and managed presentation, had looked at Arissa for a long moment before speaking. She asked 3 questions. Specific, careful, pointed questions about the circumstances of the accident, the witness accounts, and the search for a body. Arissa answered all 3 without hesitation, without blinking, and without her expression shifting by even a fraction. Mareth looked at her own hands on the council table. She looked at the other council members. Then she called the vote. She abstained herself, not voted against, not voted for. Abstained. She noted her abstention formally in the record, along with a written statement that the absence of a recovered body constituted an incomplete factual basis for the governance decision being made. That detail would matter later. Kailerin had been present at the vote. He was a quiet man, politically observant, personally ambitious in ways he expressed only when he was certain of his audience. And he had made himself useful to Erissa's ascent with a focused efficiency that suggested he had been waiting precisely for this kind of door to open. Lyriel Voswin had watched him at the first official council meeting following the vote and felt something cold move through her. She could not name it precisely, but she had been in palace politics long enough to recognize what political opportunism looked like when it was wearing a composed, helpful face. She went back to her quarters that night and sat in the dark. She did not believe Zephyria was dead. She had no evidence for this belief. No body confirmed elsewhere, no whistleblower, no official testimony that contradicted Erissa's account. What she had was 8 years of knowing a specific person, well enough to understand that Zephyria was exactly the kind of person who survived things she was not supposed to survive. She did not say this out loud. She kept her position. She attended her duties. She smiled at the right moments and was forgettable at the right moments and watched everything with the focused attention of someone who intended to be very useful at a very specific moment that had not yet arrived. And she began, very quietly, to collect information. Torvian Blackmere arrived at the capital 6 days after the official announcement, with Corvin Lismere and a delegation sized precisely to communicate official visit rather than military action. Though anyone who knew him well would have recognized that distinction as having limited operational significance if he chose otherwise. Erissa received him in the formal receiving room, dressed impeccably, her expression carrying grief in the controlled, appropriate quantity of someone who had thought carefully about exactly how much grief was optimal for the occasion. He accepted the official account. He appeared to accept it. He absolutely did not accept it. He had his people begin their own investigation the same day. Quiet conversations in the kinds of places where official accounts develop cracks. The kitchens, the outer guard rotations, the stables, said the laundry staff who had processed court clothing in the weeks before the fall, and noticed with the unspoken fluency of people who observe everything and are never asked about it, an unusual tension between the two sisters in those final days. He returned to the Eastern Territories, and he waited. His wolf, which had howled on that night and had not entirely stopped, remained stubbornly, uncomplicatedly convinced that she was alive. 4 months after the fall, Zephyria's wolf came back fully in a single, unannounced moment. The way rivers come back in spring, not gradually, but all at once, suddenly present and impossible to ignore. She was in the middle of a sparring session with Aranth Valian, getting the better of it for once, and then something cracked open inside her chest and the wolf stepped through it, and the world became immediately, overwhelmingly, sensory. She stopped mid-movement. Aranth lowered his arm. "Zephyria!" "It's back," she said. Her voice came out strange, thick with something that was not quite tears, but was the exact texture of tears without the water. She pressed her palm flat over her sternum and felt the wolf settle against it like a large, warm animal finally coming home. She shifted that night for the first time since the fall, in the open grass beyond the settlement under a half moon that looked nothing like the full silver disk she had fallen under. The shift felt like being reborn, not painless, it never was, but clean and necessary and deeply, completely true. She ran until her lungs burned and her legs had remembered what they were built for. When she shifted back, she lay in the grass and looked up at the stars and cried, briefly and with the particular quality of release that comes from setting down something carried too long. Then she got up, and went back to the settlement. The mate bond reawakened over the following 2 weeks, like a signal strengthening as a gap closes. She felt Torvian first as a warmth at her sternum, then as a direction, east the way it had always been, then as an emotion, steady, searching, patient in the specific way of someone whose patience is a choice and not a default. He knew she was alive, not the details, not the full truth of it, but the fundamental fact. He had always known it in the same wordless, bone-deep way she knew it herself. And he was preparing. She could feel the deliberate quality of his restraint from here, the careful, strategic patience of a man who understood that arriving at the capital without a fully built case would only make things worse for her. He was working. He was waiting for the right moment. She needed to move before that moment became his to determine. She told Dravor that night. "The bond is back," she said. "He can feel me clearly now. He is going to act soon. And I do not want him arriving at the capital before I do. Why not let him handle it? Because this is not his crown to restore. It is mine to reclaim." She paused, choosing the next words carefully. "I am not returning because someone came to rescue me. I am returning because the people of this dominion deserve what was taken from them, and I have spent 4 months becoming the person who can actually give it to them." Dravor looked at her across the fire for a long moment, and then, "We leave at week's end." They moved with 7 settlements worth of rogue wolves, which was not an army in the official sense, and was exactly an army in every practical one. Dravor had made his case to the settlement leaders with characteristic directness. The capital was under illegitimate governance that had demonstrated its willingness to eliminate rather than lead, and would eventually extend its reach to the settlements that had been left alone, only because they had been forgotten. Defending what they had built meant addressing the center, not destroying it, correcting it. Not all of them came for Zephyria specifically. Some came for the principles she had articulated over 4 months of living and working among them. Some came because Dravor had asked and Dravor's word meant something out here. Some, genuinely, came because Arinth Valion had framed it as the kind of undertaking that made a person feel they had done something worth remembering, and that was a sufficient reason for more people than the politically minded might assume. She did not mind the range of motivations. She had stopped believing that a united cause required identical reasons. People arrived at the right thing through many different doors. Lyriel Voswin made contact 4 days before they reached the capital. A message arrived through the rogue settlement network in a handwriting Zephyria would have recognized with both eyes closed. 3 sentences. "I knew you were alive. The council is fracturing. Mareth Silvaris is waiting." Zephyria read it 3 times. Then she wrote back in the private shorthand she and Lyriel had developed over years of palace correspondence. The kind of code that looks like a shopping list and means something entirely different to the 2 people who built it. She had 2 specific requests. Lyriel confirmed both within a day. Mareth Silvaris sent her own message through a separate channel that suggested she had also spent considerable time identifying rogue settlement networks, which was not entirely surprising for a council leader who had been in her position for 30 years. It contained a single line. "I have been waiting for the person who sent this note for longer than you know." They entered the capital at dawn, through the old trade road at the Eastern Market Quarter. The route no one secured against political comebacks, because political comebacks were not supposed to be possible. Word moved through the city ahead of them, the way heat moves through still air. Invisible from a distance, and then suddenly, everywhere at once. People came out to the streets, not to fight, simply to confirm with their own eyes what the whispers had been saying all morning. Now, by the time Zephyria reached the Moon Throne Hall, the square outside held enough of the city's residents that the space was full without being chaotic, quiet, and watching in the way that people watch something they have been waiting for. She had chosen her clothes deliberately. Not the silver court gown, but practical dark clothes. No crown, her long dark hair unadorned. She was not returning as a ceremony. She was returning as a person. The hall was in session when the doors opened. Erisa was elevated in the chair that was not technically the throne, but had been dressed and positioned to function as one. Lauren at her shoulder. The council arranged below in their formal order. She was midway through a trade agreement presentation. The doors opened and the room stopped. Zephyria walked in with Dravor at her right side and Aranth Valian 2 steps behind. And through the open doors, the council could see, if they cared to look, the outer square full of people and rogue wolves who had arranged themselves with considerable self-discipline. Mayoreth Silvaris rose from her council seat before anyone else moved. She did not look surprised. She looked deeply, quietly relieved. The way someone looks when something they have been holding privately for months is finally allowed to exist in the open. The council recognizes, she began. The council recognizes nothing, Erisa said sharply. Her composure fractured at the edges in a way that was, perhaps, the most honest Zephyria had ever seen from her. She is dead. There was a search. There was a recovery process. A recovery process that found nobody, Marat said, evenly and clearly, which I noted formally at the time, which I have been noting on the official record, formally, for 4 months. The council's abstention vote stands in the record alongside my written objection. Lauren stepped forward. This is a political performance. The woman is... The bond hit Zephyria like a wave arriving from behind. She felt him before she heard him. The south doors opening, and Torvian Blackmere walking through them with Corvin Lismere at his back and an expression on his face that was somewhere between controlled fury and something far softer that he did not have public language for. His wolf found hers across the length of the hall, and they both pulled toward each other at the same moment, not physically, but in the particular way of 2 people whose bond has been muted for months and is now blazing fully open, warm, and total, and unmistakable to anyone in the room looking at their faces. He stopped walking when he saw her. She looked at him. The hall felt it. Even people who had no bond of their own could see it in the way 2 people who have been separated by something unsurvivable suddenly exist in the same room again. Something in the air changed, like the moment before a long rain finally arrives. Lauren opened his mouth. Torvian turned a look on him that made him close it. I have documentation, Torvian said, into the silence, with the measured calm of a man who has been building toward this moment for 4 months and is not about to rush it now. From 4 sources within this palace. Witness accounts of 2 figures on the moon tower. Platform the night of the incident. Guard rotation records showing a single figure returning. A statement from a palace worker on the lower level who heard, from the platform above, what he described as a scream that stopped abruptly. He held the documents up. Well, I had planned to present this to the council next week. She arrived before I needed to. He looked at Zephyria. Something passed across his face. Private, brief, not for the room. And she felt it echo through the bond like a warm current. He had always believed. He had never, not once, stopped. Erisa. did not cry. That was the thing Zephyria would remember most. She had expected something, some collapse of the mask, some final accounting that looked like remorse. What she got instead was a coldness that had perhaps always been there and was now simply no longer being managed. "You want me to say I'm sorry," Erissa said. "I want you to understand what you did," Zephyria answered. "Not to me. To the people who spent 4 months under governance built on my death. To Lyriel, who navigated 4 months of danger to protect the truth. To every person in this dominion who deserved better than a leadership crisis engineered for ambition." "You always did this," Erissa said. And for the first time, there was something raw in her voice, something that was not composed at all. "Made it about everyone else. Made yourself the one who cared more. Stood there being so relentlessly good that there was no room left to be anything else." "I genuinely do care more," Zephyria said, without cruelty. "That is not a superiority. It is simply true. And I believe, that it is the thing that hurt you most, because it was not something that could be learned or claimed or taken. It was just mine." She paused. "I wish that had been easier for you. I truly do." The hall was completely silent. "You will stand trial before the full council," Zephyria continued. "You will answer for what you did under the rule of law this dominion is built on. I will not predetermine that outcome, and I will not interfere with it. What I will tell you is this. I am choosing not to destroy you, not because I have forgotten, not because what happened was acceptable, but because I refuse to become something smaller in response to what you did to me." She looked at Kaloran. "That applies to you as well." Kaloran, who had made his political calculations very quickly in the last 5 minutes, wore the expression of a man who was deeply grateful to be included in an offer of legal process, rather than something more immediate. Myrith Silveris called the full council to emergency session that same afternoon. She presented her 4 months of formal objections, the documentation Torvian had gathered, and Zephyria's petition to resume the Ascension process under emergency succession protocols. The vote was unanimous. Even the council members who had served most efficiently under Erissa's interim rule voted in favor, some from conscience, some from pragmatism, and some, Zephyria suspected, from the particular relief of people who have been waiting for permission to do the right thing and have finally received it. Torvian found her afterward in the south garden, one in the corner with the silver-leafed trees that she had always liked and that no one else used because it was inconveniently placed. She was sitting on the stone bench with her face turned up toward the late afternoon light. She heard him coming and did not turn around, partly because she could feel him through the bond with perfect accuracy and did not need to see him to know exactly where he was, and partly because she needed one more moment of open sky and quiet breathing before she was fully ready. He sat beside her. Neither of them said anything for a while. The bond did most of it. 4 months of distance and fear and stubborn, evidence-defying belief, exchanged in the way of 2 people who had found something true in each other and had spent considerable time having it tested. "You knew," she said, finally. "I knew. 4 months is a long time to know without certainty." "Almost certainty," he corrected. "There were approximately 4 nights where I was less than almost certain." "Only 4? Your wolf is very loud," he said, which was possibly the most romantically inexact thing anyone had ever said to her. And she loved him for it in a way that was simple and complete and required no ceremony to be true. She turned and put her hand against the side of his face. He closed his eyes. I need to be crowned first, she said softly. Then the bond ceremony. I know. You're not even slightly irritated by that. I have spent 4 months almost certain you were alive, he said. I can wait 4 more days. She kissed him there in the garden anyway, because the ceremony could wait. But the man who had felt her fall and had never stopped believing deserved not to wait for everything. The Ascension happened 1 week later on a clear evening. Zephyria walked into the moon-throne hall alone. No formal procession, no ceremonial escort, just herself and the wolf oath and the crown that had been waiting. She wore the silver thread gown. Lyriel had retrieved it from palace storage and spent 3 days restoring it, with the focused intensity of someone who had been waiting 4 months to do exactly one specific thing and was going to do it properly. When the crown settled on her head, the hall responded not with polished ceremonial applause, but with the kind of sound that comes from people who feel something genuine and cannot hold it quietly. A sound that moved outward from the hall to the square, and through the square into the city, and kept going. In the back of the hall, Dravor stood with Aranth Valion and several settlement leaders who had technically been banned from the capital for years. Mayoreth Silveris had, technically, not noticed this. It was not, technically, an oversight. Aranth nudged Dravor. She did it. Obviously, Dravor said. You could look more pleased. I am exactly as pleased as I appear to be. Which looks like absolutely nothing at all. Which is to say, Dravor said, entirely. The bond ceremony happened 3 nights after the Ascension, privately, with Lyriel and Corvin Lismere as the only witnesses. No speeches, no political observers, no audience. Just 2 people completing something that had existed between them long before the official recognition, in the particular warmth of a bond that had survived 4 months of silence and fear and absolute refusal to give up. When it sealed, Zephyria felt it settle into something permanent. Not a thread, but a foundation. The kind of thing built to last through everything. Torvian held her face in both hands and looked at her with the expression she had come to understand was his way of being completely undone, which he expressed by bypassing words entirely and communicating everything anyway. There you are, he said. I was always here, she answered. He kissed her with the particular thoroughness of someone who has spent 4 months, almost certain, and is finally, fully, absolutely certain. And the night outside was full of stars. And the dominion below them was beginning its first full day, under a queen who had been shaped entirely by what she had survived. Arissa and Kaloran stood trial before the full council 6 weeks later. Arissa was found guilty of attempted murder, political fraud, and unlawful seizure of governance authority. Her sentence was exile. Stripped of her titles, removed from the capital, placed under supervised residency at the eastern territorial border. Not a death sentence. Not a comfortable life. Something in between, with a door to redemption present, but not held open. Kaloran, whose involvement had been facilitative rather than initiating, received a reduced but real consequence. Stripped of rank, barred from political office, confined to a minor holding under monitored governance. Neither thanked the court for the leniency. Zephyria had not offered it to receive gratitude. She had offered it because the alternative, executing her sister, destroying the man Arissa had bound herself to regardless of his culpability, would have made her something she refused to become. She had been pushed off a tower and gotten up. She was not going to let cruelty reshape her on the way back down. Mareth Silveris, who had abstained from the original vote and spent 4 months maintaining a formal record of objections at personal political risk, was formally commended and elevated to Chief Council Advisor, a position created specifically because Zephyria believed that principled neutrality, held in an impossible situation, deserved both recognition and continued deployment. Lyriel Voswin was offered a formal title. She declined it, which Zephyria had known she would, and instead requested expanded authority over palace resource management and direct access to address supply inequities in the outer territories. It was granted before she finished the sentence. Dravor returned to the rogue settlements, as he had always intended. Before leaving, he and Zephyria signed a territorial recognition agreement, the first of its kind in the Dominion's history, formally acknowledging the rogue settlements as legitimate communities with legal standing, access to Dominion protections, and representation in governance decisions. He said nothing about it during the signing. When Zephyria looked up from the completed document, he gave her a single nod that, for Dravor, was the equivalent of a standing ovation. Elwyn Mireth was appointed Chief Healer of the Dominion and accepted on the condition that the role included authority to train healers in the outer territories. Zephyria agreed so immediately that Elwyn later told Arinth she had not even finished stating the condition before the answer came. Arinth Valion joined the palace guard and became, within 3 months, so thoroughly beloved by the kitchen staff that the head cook began saving him portions of whatever was best that day. He was also moderately notorious for telling extremely long stories during patrol duty that somehow always ended at the exact moment his shift changed, which Corvin Lismere regarded as either coincidence or considerable tactical skill. Before we close this chapter, I want to pause here for just a moment. If something in Zephyria's journey touched you, her refusal to become bitter, her choice to return not for revenge but for justice, the love that survived 4 months of silence. Please do not let it stay quiet inside you. Stories like this reach more hearts when you show up for them. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, drop a comment, and let me know where you are watching or listening from. Tell me the part of this story that stayed with you. I read every single comment, and it means more than you know. Thank you. Now, let us finish this together.